Imagine a king so wealthy, he gave away so much gold on a single journey that he crashed entire economies. A ruler so powerful, Europe deliberately erased him from history books for centuries. This is the true story of the richest human being who ever lived, and why you've probably never heard of him. Before we dive into this incredible story, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. This is the kind of history they never taught us in school, and you won't want to miss what comes next. Trust me, by the end of this video, you'll understand why this story was hidden for so long. What if everything you learned about wealth, power, and African history was incomplete? What if the richest person who ever walked this earth wasn't a tech billionaire or an oil tycoon, but a 14th century African king whose story was deliberately hidden from the world? His name was Mansa Musa, and he ruled the Mali Empire in West Africa. When economists adjusted his wealth for inflation, they stopped counting at $400 billion. That's more than Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, and Bill Gates combined. But here's the thing. Most people have never heard his name. And that's not by accident. This is a story about gold, power, and one of history's greatest cover-ups. This is the story of the black African king Europe tried to erase from history. To understand Mansa Musa, we need to understand the empire he ruled. In the 14th century, while Europe was struggling through the Dark Ages, the Mali Empire was one of the most advanced civilizations on Earth. The empire stretched across West Africa, covering an area larger than Western Europe. It included parts of what we now call Mali, Senegal, Gambia, Guinea, Niger, Nigeria, Chad, and Mauritania. This wasn't some small tribal kingdom. This was a sophisticated empire with organized government, advanced architecture, and thriving cities. But here's what made Mali truly extraordinary. Gold. Lots of it. West Africa at that time produced nearly half of the world's gold supply. The Mali Empire sat on top of some of the richest gold mines humanity has ever discovered. Gold was so common in Mali that it was used for everyday items. While European kings desperately sought gold to fill their treasuries, Mansa Musa had so much of it that he literally didn't know what to do with it all. The capital city, Timbuktu, became a center of learning and trade. Scholars traveled from across Africa, the Middle East, and even Europe to study at its universities. The city had more than 25,000 students and one of the largest libraries in the world, with hundreds of thousands of manuscripts. The empire had organized tax systems, legal codes, and diplomatic relations with other nations. Merchants from across the known world came to trade in Mali's markets. The cities had paved streets, impressive buildings, and complex water systems. This was civilization at its peak. But despite all this wealth and advancement, something strange happened in history books. The Mali Empire's achievements were downplayed, ignored, or completely erased. Why? Because acknowledging a powerful, wealthy, educated African civilization didn't fit the narrative that European colonizers needed to justify what they would later do to Africa. Mansa Musa came to power in 1312. The word Mansa means King of Kings or Emperor. His full name was Musa Keita I, and he inherited the throne after the previous ruler, Abu Bakr II, disappeared during an expedition to explore the Atlantic Ocean. Yes, you heard that right. African rulers were launching ocean expeditions decades before Columbus sailed to the Americas. But that's another story they didn't teach us in school. When Mansa Musa took the throne, he was already ruling over an incredibly wealthy empire, but he didn't just sit on his wealth, he had a vision. He wanted Mali to be known not just for its gold, but for its knowledge, culture, and devotion to Islam. Mansa Musa was a devout Muslim, and this faith would drive one of the most legendary journeys in human history. He decided to make the Hajj, the sacred pilgrimage to Mecca, that every Muslim is supposed to make at least once in their lifetime. Islamic law required him to make this journey, and he took this religious duty seriously. But Mansa Musa wasn't going to travel like an ordinary pilgrim. He was a king, and he wanted the whole world to know it. Now, most people who made this pilgrimage traveled quietly with a small group. Not Mansa Musa. When this king decided to make a journey, he did it in a way the world had never seen before and has never seen since. In 1324, Mansa Musa set out for Mecca. But calling it a trip doesn't do it justice. This was a royal procession that looked more like a moving city. Picture this: 60,000 people in his traveling party. Let that number sink in. 60,000 people. That's bigger than most cities in Europe at that time. The caravan included soldiers to protect the group, officials to manage logistics, merchants to handle trade, royal attendants, and thousands of others. There were entertainers and musicians playing as they walked across the desert. But here's where it gets really incredible. Historical records say he brought 12,000 servants with him, and each one carried 4 pounds of gold bars. Let me do the math for you. That's 48,000 pounds of gold. In today's money, that's worth over $1.5 billion, just in gold bars alone. But wait, there's more. Mansa Musa also brought 80 camels, and each camel carried 300 pounds of gold dust. That's another 24,000 pounds of gold. Now, you might be thinking, he brought all this gold to pay for things along the way. That's partly true, but here's what makes this story legendary. He brought it to give away. As Mansa Musa traveled through the Sahara Desert and into Egypt, he handed out gold to everyone he met. Poor people on the street received gold. Government officials received gold. Religious leaders received gold. Random strangers received gold. He built mosques in every city he stopped in. He gave gold to charity. He paid for everything in gold. He gave tips in gold. The generosity was unlike anything the world had ever seen. In every city he passed through, people talked about the Golden King from Africa. Word spread fast across the Mediterranean and into Europe. Traders, scholars, and officials couldn't stop talking about the man who had more gold than entire kingdoms. When he arrived in Cairo, Egypt's most important city, and one of the richest cities in the world at that time, he handed out so much gold that he completely destroyed the economy. Let me explain how this happened. Gold is valuable because it's rare. When something is rare, people want it, and that makes it expensive. But when someone dumps massive amounts of gold into a city, suddenly it's not rare anymore. Supply goes up, demand stays the same, and the value crashes. The value of gold in Cairo dropped so dramatically that it caused massive inflation. Prices for basic goods skyrocketed because gold was now worth so little. Bread that cost 1 gold piece suddenly cost 10. The entire economic system of the city collapsed. According to historical records written by Arab historians who documented this event, it took 12 years for Cairo's economy to recover from Mansa Musa's visit. 12 years. One man, on one trip, crashed an economy so badly that it took over a decade to fix. Think about the scale of wealth required to do that. Cairo wasn't a small village. It was one of the richest, most important cities in the entire world. And one man threw its economy into chaos just by being generous. When Mansa Musa realized what he had done, he actually tried to fix it. On his way back home, he stopped in Cairo again and borrowed gold at extremely high interest rates to take gold back out of circulation. He was literally taking out loans to remove gold from the economy and restore balance. Think about that for a second. He was so wealthy that when he accidentally broke an economy, he had to borrow back his own gold just to repair the damage he'd caused by giving too much away. The journey continued to Mecca, where he performed his religious duties, met with scholars and leaders from across the Islamic world, and further cemented his reputation as the wealthiest king alive. He prayed at the holy sites, gave more donations, and built more mosques. News of this incredible journey spread across 3 continents. Arab historians documented it in detail. Merchants told stories about it in trade ports from Spain to India. People talked about the Golden King from Africa, who had more wealth than anyone had ever seen. His pilgrimage became one of the most talked about events of the entire 14th century. For years afterward, people across Africa, the Middle East, and Europe knew about Mansa Musa and his legendary generosity. So here's the question that should be on everyone's mind. If Mansa Musa was so famous, so incredibly wealthy, and his journey was documented by multiple reliable sources, why didn't we learn about him in school? Why do most people today have no idea who he was? The answer is both simple and disturbing. European powers deliberately erased him from history. But they didn't do it overnight. In fact, for a while, Europeans absolutely acknowledged his existence. On the Catalan Atlas, one of the most important and detailed medieval maps created in 1375, there's a prominent drawing of Mansa Musa. He's sitting on a throne, holding a large gold nugget in his hand, wearing a crown on his head. The map describes him as the richest and most distinguished king in all the land. European cartographers knew about him. Traders who did business in North Africa knew about him. Scholars who studied geography and world politics knew about him. For decades, he was recognized as a legitimate world power. So what changed? Why did he disappear from history? Colonization changed everything. By the time European powers started seriously carving up Africa in the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries, they needed a narrative that justified what they were doing. They needed to convince themselves, their citizens, and the world that Africans were primitive, uncivilized, backward people who needed European intervention to be saved. They called it the civilizing mission. They claimed they were bringing progress, Christianity, and civilization to a dark continent that had none of these things. But how could they justify colonizing and enslaving people from a continent that had produced empires wealthier than European kingdoms? How could they claim Africans were inferior and uncivilized when there was clear historical evidence of sophisticated African civilizations with advanced governments, universities, and international trade networks? The answer was simple and brutal. They rewrote history. African achievements were systematically erased from textbooks. The great universities of Timbuktu were forgotten, or their importance was minimized. The architectural marvels were either destroyed or attributed to outside influences, with some European scholars even claiming Arabs or Europeans must have built them. The wealth was explained away as a lucky accident or wildly exaggerated by unreliable sources. Mansa Musa's story was particularly dangerous to colonial narratives because it proved several things European colonizers wanted to hide. It proved that Africa had powerful, organized empires with sophisticated governments. It proved that African rulers were educated, cultured, and deeply religious. It proved that Africa was incredibly wealthy in its own right, not poor and desperate. It proved that African civilizations were connected to the wider world through trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange. And most importantly, It proved that black kings commanded genuine respect and admiration from Arab and even European powers. All of these facts contradicted the racist narrative that colonizers needed to justify the slave trade and colonial exploitation. So Mansa Musa disappeared from Western history books. His story continued to be taught in West Africa through oral traditions. Islamic scholars in the Middle East still wrote about him. But in Europe and later in America, he became a footnote if he was mentioned at all. And more often, he was completely left out. Generations of students grew up learning about European kings, Chinese dynasties, and Middle Eastern empires, but never hearing about the richest man who ever lived, simply because he was African, and his story didn't fit the narrative of African inferiority. But here's what the colonizers couldn't erase: the actual impact Mansa Musa had on his empire and the world. When Mansa Musa returned from his pilgrimage, he didn't just come back with stories and memories. He brought back architects from Egypt, scholars from Arabia, and builders from across the Islamic world. He hired these experts and paid them extremely well to transform Mali into an even greater center of Islamic learning and culture. He commissioned the construction of the famous Jinguereber Mosque in Timbuktu. This mosque, designed by a Spanish-Arab architect he met during his journey, still stands today. It's been standing for over 700 years, a testament to the engineering skills and architectural vision of that time. He massively expanded the University of Sankore, which had been founded before his reign. He brought in scholars, funded research, and turned it into one of the world's most important centers of learning. At its peak, the university had more books and manuscripts than most European libraries. Students came from across Africa and the Islamic world to study mathematics, astronomy, medicine, law, and theology. Mansa Musa established schools throughout his empire. He promoted literacy and made sure even children in smaller towns had access to education. He created a legal system based on Islamic law that was considered fair and just. He expanded trade networks that connected West Africa to Europe, North Africa, the Middle East, and even Asia. Under his rule, the Mali Empire reached its greatest extent, controlling trade routes that stretched across the Sahara Desert. He maintained such strong security that historical accounts say travelers could cross the entire empire without fear of robbery or violence. That kind of stability and safety was rare in the medieval world. He ruled for 25 years, until his death around 1337. Even after he died, his empire remained powerful and prosperous for more than another century. His successors continued his policies, and Mali remained a major world power. But perhaps his greatest legacy is what we're doing right now: remembering him and sharing his story. Despite centuries of deliberate erasure, despite calculated attempts to hide his achievements, the truth survived. It survived in oral traditions passed down through generations. It survived in Arabic texts preserved by Islamic scholars. It survived in African academic institutions. And now, in the age of information, his story is being rediscovered and shared with the world. You might be wondering why a 700-year-old story about an African king matters in today's world. It matters because history shapes how we see ourselves and others. When African history is erased or minimized in education, it affects how people view Africa and African descendants today. It perpetuates harmful stereotypes. It hides incredible achievements. It creates an incomplete and false picture of human civilization. Mansa Musa's story proves that Africa wasn't a primitive continent waiting to be discovered and civilized by Europeans. It was home to sophisticated empires, brilliant leaders, and incredible wealth. It was connected to global networks of trade, culture, and learning centuries before European colonization. His story also teaches us something about wealth itself. In today's world, We often celebrate billionaires who accumulate more and more money. Mansa Musa showed a different way. He used his wealth to build universities and promote education. He supported the poor and invested in infrastructure. He spread prosperity rather than hoarding it. And his story reminds us of something crucial. History is written by those in power, and sometimes the most important stories are the ones they deliberately tried to hide. Mansa Musa, the black African king who Europe tried to erase from history. A man so wealthy he crashed economies just by being generous. A ruler who built universities and promoted learning across his empire. A leader whose civilization rivaled or exceeded anything Europe had at the time. For centuries, his story was deliberately hidden, buried beneath colonial narratives that sought to diminish and erase African achievements. But the truth has a way of surviving. The truth doesn't stay buried forever. If this story opened your eyes the way it opened mine, here's what I need you to do right now. Hit that like button. Share this video with friends, family, teachers, anyone who needs to hear this story. Drop a comment below and tell me, had you heard of Mansa Musa before today? If this is your first time learning about him, what surprised you most? Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications because we're going to keep uncovering these hidden stories. These forgotten kings and queens. These erased chapters of history that deserve to be told. History is so much bigger, richer, and more diverse than what most of us were taught in school. The next time someone tells you Africa has no history, you'll know the truth. The next time someone tries to diminish African achievements, you'll have the knowledge to push back. Because now you know about Mansa Musa, the king who was so wealthy and so powerful that they had to erase him from history just to make their lies believable. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.